Hi everybody, I'm Terry Tazioli. I work with the University Bookstore Events Group. We bring wonderful human beings like these two here and lots of others. Something like between 500 and 700 events a year. So here we go again. And sometimes, as we were talking earlier, we have a crowd of 1 people or a crowd of 1,200. You just never know. So thank you for being here. Molly Hashimoto and David Williams. They're going to talk a lot about themselves, which is great. You see that where it says in conversation with Terry Tazioli? I'm going to be right here flinging questions at them in case they've run out of things to say, knowing these two I don't think they will. Right? And what I love about today's conversation with you two and with us is that we get to learn from you how to look at things just a little bit differently. And maybe even stop and don't smell roses, but stare at what's around us and then find a way to preserve that for ourselves. Photography, paintings, whatever it is. You've both done a lot of that already. I want you to tell us your secrets because I'm just desperate to know these things. Like that thing that you flashed up earlier that looked like a snake with a...
Oh, yeah, I'm not going to show that. But...
You're not?
No, sorry.
Oh, good. That's my own personal little thing.
Yeah, it's a secret. There it is. You've learned one secret, then I have one.
So thank you all, and thank you for being here, you two. And take it away. Tell us about yourselves and tell us about this wonderful idea.
Great. So I'm David, obviously, just to clarify that. And so what Molly and I, when we sort of started talking about this and thinking about how to share some ideas, we thought it'd be most interesting to start a little bit with our backgrounds on who we are and sort of how we came to have our interest and passion for these subjects. And I'm coming at observation from the point of view of a writer who's looking at making connections. And Molly is coming out with a very different attitude, or not very different, a complementary attitude, less about writing and more about sketching and painting and drawing. And so what we're going to do is she's going to talk for a few minutes at the beginning, maybe 5 or 10. I'll follow up, and then we'll maybe chat a little bit, but also anytime you want to ask us questions, please feel free to. This is not a set way of, we don't have a particular mandate or goal except to share ideas and talk with you all. So I will give it to Molly and see where we go from there.
Okay, thanks. I'm starting with a lot of pictures because that's what I'm all about. So here's one of my sketchbooks at the base of Colonial Peak and Diablo, at Diablo Lake, and Pyramid Peak's the one on the right. And I started with this one because I wanted to tell you about this writer who I thought was really instrumental in how I think about these things. Her name is Maxine Green, and she was an educational philosopher and social activist. And she wrote that it was very important for people to plunge into subject matter in order to steep themselves in it. There must be an answering activity if we are to perceive what presents itself to us. We must reach out toward the object through an act of consciousness that grasps that which is presented. And you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, go louder.
Oh, sure.
If you hold it about.
You want me to be in charge? I can hold this, you can just tell me to go anytime you want.
So we can take selfies, that's a possibility, but I don't think that's the same kind of reaching out that Maxine Green was talking about. And so the sketchbook is my way of reaching out.
Great.
I've been teaching for the North Cascades Institute for about 15 years now, and I take students out. Here we are at the Diablo Lake Overlook, and I get real comfortable when I'm out sketching with my students. My Coleman camp chair with its little cup holder. That's me, kind of slouching, painting, yeah, having a good time. The other people don't get as comfortable as I do.
Oh, I keep forgetting what I'm supposed to be doing. She looks at me and like...
So these are some of my mini sketchbooks, and just thought I'd show you, and you might be wondering how do I do that? How do I fill that many sketchbooks? So I put little thumbnail sketches in there with water-soluble pens, watercolor. It's real easy to fill up a sketchbook with very quick sketches like that.
Molly, I have a question for you.
Yes.
that the previous page, is that one page in a sketchbook?
Yes.
Or are those, it is?
Yes.
All in one?
Yeah. And, yeah, so they're very tiny. That's why they're called thumbnails.
Okay.
You know, kind of like you see them when you put up your photos. You know, they're very small, so you kind of get a feel. I like doing this because I feel when I look at it later, it has kind of a cinematic quality. You know, like, oh, this was the entire thing that I was experiencing for, say, a period of an hour. I enjoy that.
So you would take about an hour to do?
Yeah, at most. At
Okay,
most.
so these are really quick.
Very quick.
Okay.
Yep.
That would take me like a year to get probably that one.
Well, you'd be surprised. I teach a lot, and I teach absolute beginners. I do programs for King County Library, and people who've never done anything do these kinds of things with me, and they do quite well. So here's another thing from my sketchbook. This is Wizard Island at Crater Lake. My husband and I were there. It was about 40 degrees. And I drew it, and I thought, I don't think we're going to stay out here. So I took a picture. I do take a lot of photos. I use them as reference. And then went back to the warm place that we were staying, and I quickly painted the blues, and I kind of liked its unfinished quality. So that, too, is a way to fill up a sketchbook really fast, not to ever finish anything. Because, gosh, I think about 50% of the stuff in my sketchbooks is not finished. And just recently, I was up in the North Cascades teaching for the Institute again, and we went up to Washington Pass at the absolute peak of the larches turning golden. And it was one of those days that was unbelievable. It was quite cold to begin with, but there was no wind, and the sun warmed us, and we sat there for 2 hours painting. And I think every single person in the class, we had 15, was, I don't know, they somehow felt like they were just being blessed in some way on that day. We just had the most wonderful time. And yeah, the larches, we have something really special here in the Northwest that nobody else has. Okay, quickly, my start in life. This is me, my twin, and our dad proudly standing beside our Ford Woody station wagon. And Dad loved the Rocky Mountains. We grew up in Denver some of the time. He was a military guy, so you might notice one of us is wearing a West Point t-shirt. Anyway, so we would take trips up to the Rockies, and Dad would drive the car and scare the heck out of us because, you know, he'd be pointing out the Rockies. Look at the majestic Rockies. And, Dad, get your hand on the steering wheel, please. You know, it was scary.
So did he inspire you with color?
Not at all.
I mean, it seems like he should have.
Yes, he did like those, you know.
You have a question too?
Yeah, when was that picture taken?
In the 50s, yes. I was a child in the 50s, and my dad was so proud of that car. It was his first new car. Yeah, we loved it too. You know, no one wore seat belts. We all just would sleep in the back of the car, kind of rolling around. There were 5 of us, so that was crazy.
5 kids or 5 people in the family?
5 kids.
Wow.
And 2 dogs. Yeah, it was crazy. So, and I got my start wanting to keep sketchbooks, wanting to keep them in, going to Yellowstone and seeing Thomas Moran's field sketches in the Albright Visitor Center. They used to have quite a good display of his field sketches, and the family and I had been all around the park and seen all the things that he had done the field sketches of. And I don't know why, but I just felt like I had to do it. And I was reading a book at the time. I don't know if any of you read W.G. Sebald, but he wrote a book called Austerlitz, and he talked about how, I wrote the quote down because it's been bouncing around in my head ever since I read it. He said, "Might it not be that we have appointments to keep in the past and must go there in search of places and people who have some connection with us on the far side of time?" And I felt that very deeply about Moran and a couple of these other artists I'm going to show you. So in my book, I talk about my artist heroes and heroines. For some reason, these look a little bit elongated. I don't know why, but just picture them being a little more spread out. I don't know what happened. We did a little syncing, and I think something funny happened. But this is Yellowstone Canyon, something that Moran painted famously.
Is this your sketch or
Yeah.
mine?
Another artist that I really fell in love with was Karl Popper. Don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but he traveled with the German prince Maximilian of Neuwied, and that was a man who kind of modeled himself after Alexander von Humboldt. And they took a trip up the Missouri, kind of following in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. And Bodmer was hired, a Swiss artist and engraver, to document the native peoples and the flora and fauna that they encountered, as well as the landscapes. And I thought his watercolors were just fabulous, so these two books really inspired me. And I went on a trip up there as a result. So do you see the tiny figure at the base of the cliffs? That's me. Yeah, thank you, David. It's a remarkably beautiful place, and there's no one there, ever.
Where was it?
This is north central Montana, the upper Missouri River, also known as Missouri Breaks, the wild and scenic Missouri River. And on the trip, I was on this boat trip with this guy who had a Coast Guard license to take a runabout boat up the Missouri. And because I didn't have time to do the whole canoe trip. So I was drawing these while we were going about 30 miles an hour on our back way upriver. And I felt the same feeling as when I saw Moran, which was that I was kind of reaching back in time and in some way meeting Bodmer. And it was a thrill, like, I think David has probably felt this, you know, about some of his historical research. A way of meeting someone from the past, but in a place out of time. Another one of my heroines is Abby Williams Hill. Don't know if you've heard of her, but she was a painter from Washington, hired by the Great Northern Railway to document things in Yellowstone. It was kind of an idea of encouraging tourism. So here she is camping with her 4 children in Yellowstone. I always point this out, but she appears to be the only person having a good time in this picture. And her kids were pretty forgiving. And she also did this beautiful oil painting. She hauled all of her oil painting gear up to the North Cascades. This was in about 1906. No one was there except miners and really tough characters, and they really gave her a lot of grief. But anyway, she did this painting of an unnamed peak, which she decided to call Mount Booker in honor of Booker T. Washington. She had taken her kids to see the Tuskegee Institute, and she was so impressed with him and with the work he was doing that she wanted to name it. And such a forward thinker, the U.S. Geological Survey said, I don't like your idea, we're not going to do it, but somehow or other she prevailed, and so the name remains Mount Booker. This is, you guys recognize Half Dome, and this is a very historic place where Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir met. And one of the things I did in the book was talk a little bit about some of the techniques that one would use in watercolor painting and sketching, and glazing is the way that I achieved that really beautiful blue glow that you see in the early morning on the granite peaks in Yosemite. Another favorite of my technique pages is this view of some mountain hemlocks, and it just shows you the difference between a very young hemlock, which really bends over gracefully, handling the burden of snow, whereas the older, bigger specimen kind of stiffly stands there. And here are a couple of grebes, western grebes, and I put them in just because I wanted to talk about how Teddy Roosevelt, again, was very influential in preserving the refuges in southern Oregon, the Klamath Basin refuges. In 1905, the Audubon Society sent out a couple of guys to find out how many of these grebes were still left, and they were being hunted for their white breast feathers for women's capes and hats. And they were almost gone. And so they reported to Audubon and then also to Teddy Roosevelt, and he signed an executive order in 1908 preserving this area as a refuge for them. So the next slide shows you how I often will use a photo and really do a pretty close rendering of the photo. You could go back, David, just so they could compare. So it's really, really close. And obviously, when I do birds, I'm not out there to, they don't sit there letting you sketch them, unlike landscapes. And I will close my remarks by just showing a painting from an upcoming book that Mountaineers is publishing called Birds of the West, an artist's guide, and it will be something like Colors of the West. It should be out in April this year, and I look forward to maybe meeting some of you again once that book is out. So, David.
All right. Let me ask you a couple questions, Molly.
Yeah.
Do you travel constantly with the sketchbook? Or how often do you carry one around with you, or is it when you know you're going to go do something?
Well, I do carry it with me whenever I travel, and I do a lot of teaching. I teach at Yellowstone, Wenatchee, River Institute in Leavenworth, Sitka Center for Art and Ecology down on the Oregon coast, and then the North Cascades Institute. So all of those teaching endeavors, I use the sketchbook. And then, yeah, when I'm with people that will tolerate it, I do it, but not often I'm with people who tolerate it. So I do take a lot of pictures, and one of the neatest things about that trip to the Upper Missouri was it was very quick, and so I didn't have much time to sketch there. But I spent probably 3 months after that trip working in my sketchbook, and I felt that it was a way to extend the duration of the trip, to relive the trip. You guys who've written or drawn or whatever, you understand that the trip is not over if you do those things. Even just putting your photos up on your computer, the trip is not over. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'm going to sort of start with a different tack and talk a little bit about time that I've spent in Utah. So I grew up in Seattle, actually just a couple miles from here, but ended up in southern Utah after college. And basically became addicted to the geology and the rocks out there, pretty easy with the red rock landscape. So that was one part of my formative interest in sort of getting more connected to the outdoors. But also during that time, I worked for the National Park Service at Arches National Park. And one of the things that always struck me working in the parks is that people would come on one of my walks. I led a variety of different walks, and they always had these great questions. They were always asking about the place that they were visiting. What's the geology? What are the plants? What are the birds? What are the insects? And I always encouraged them to ask those questions when they got back home, and thinking that national parks don't have a monopoly on interesting natural history stories or cultural history stories. And so I always say, wherever you go, ask that question again. And so after Utah, my wife and I ended up moving to Boston for a while. And basically my geology, all the geology that I knew about the East Coast could be summed up with Plymouth Rock. That's it. I knew there was a rock there, but I didn't know anything about it. So I started researching some of the history, but one day I was at the Harvard campus, and this is their oldest building, it's Harvard Hall, and the base of Harvard Hall is a red sandstone quarried in Connecticut. And on the East Coast, they call that brownstone. If you're familiar with the brownstone buildings out there, the apartment buildings, most of them were initially made of this sandstone. Well, it turns out that sandstone on the base of the Harvard Hall was formed about the same time as the geology, the rocks, the red rocks of southern Utah. And in Utah, we call them red rocks, and in the East Coast, they call them brownstone. And when it hit me is one day when I went up to the building, and being a geologist, I didn't have a rock hammer, unfortunately, so I couldn't whack a little piece of stone off the Harvard building. But it had eroded and weathered enough that I could sort of rub it in my hand and collect this little pile of red sand. And that was when I made this connection between southern Utah and the East Coast. And when I started looking at building stone as a medium, as a way to explore stories of natural history and start to, what I think, and one of my goals has long been is to be a better observer, to pay more attention, closer attention in the urban environment. And one of the reasons that Molly and I think we're teamed up is because she has a much more the sort of classic wild places, and I'm much more focused on the classic non-wild places, urban landscapes, which obviously have their own wildness, but I think there's similar lessons in terms of observing, asking questions, paying attention, slowing down, which I think each of those things
we do in slightly different ways, where Molly may be focused on painting and I'm looking at a building and wondering, why does that building look like that? Or why are there these types of birds or animals or whatever it might be in a landscape? And where this really developed for me was trying to start asking these questions in Seattle. This is my backyard. My wife and I live under a very tall Douglas fir tree. There's 3 of them you can't reach your arms around and back. But it's a place that for me is a really quiet place to go and connect to that wildness that's in an urban landscape. And I think that's one of the things that I learned living in Boston when I started asking the questions in Boston, was noticing the small wonders of the landscape there. We lived across the street from, behind us on one side was Fenway Ballpark, literally on the first base line. And on the other side was a Victory Garden that had been built during the 40s, but it also was right next to a small, what they call a river, the Muddy River, which ran for about 3 miles from Brookline into Boston. But I kept finding all these amazing stories, and so I started trying to find those stories when I moved back to Seattle. This is the tree from underneath, and this is the tree from looking, and you can see there's a bald eagle here and a bald eagle there. Which is, to me, is just astounding that I can wake in the winter to the call of a bald eagle at 5:30 in the morning or 5 in the morning. Being a morning person, I don't mind having those calls. But it was noticing these things in the landscape and trying to pay attention. Also down the block, there was a Cooper's hawk nest, and there's a study of Cooper's hawks. And I was lucky enough the day that the guy caught the Cooper's hawks, he was just across the street putting these bands on the bird. But these, we would regularly see them in our yard. I was not lucky enough to see one eat somebody else, but the fact that I was still able to notice them and see them, to me, was one of again, one of these small wonders in the landscape and again, it was because I think I was paying attention, I was sitting quietly, weird in the sense of technology. It wasn't until just about a year ago that I actually got a cell phone for the first time in my life and started to have that connection to the world. But I purposely, when I have my cell phone, I do not have it on when I'm out in the world. I don't walk with it. I don't really stop and use it to move through the landscape. I try to separate it in my life. But that to me is about, because I'm still interested in observing and paying attention. The most recent project that I worked on was a book of walks around Seattle, so 17 walks around Seattle, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of them because this is, to me, exemplifies what interests me and in my goals and observations. So this is on 14th Avenue in Capitol Hill. This road runs right into Volunteer Park, and what interested me was this little granite post right here. And I had seen this and not really understood what it was, and it turns out that it's a hitching post. So at one point in the past, Seattle used horses, meant horsepower, and you had to have a place to tie up your horse. And there's one of these here, there's another one just down the block, and then further down the block, there's a little stepping stone where when you pulled up at someone's house and you had to get off your horse or get off the carriage you're in, you could step down onto a stepping stone instead of having to go all the way down to the ground. But again, it was just walking along and seeing these and wondering, what is the story behind those? And eventually searching, this is next image is a postcard taken right after Capitol Hill was beginning to be developed in the early 1900s. And here's our hitching post. And it's hard to, go back, but this house is right in this image right here, slightly, a little bit different, but here's the water tower. But you can still see this exact hitching post. They obviously changed the street a little bit. It's now even in worse shape than probably this image from 1900 being driven down that street. So a second thing that interested me, again, I noticed and I started to ask questions and trying to understand what was the story, was this sign right here that says City Datum Elevation 18.79. This is at the Pioneer Building down at 1st and Yesler, 1st and James, right where they intersect. And what did that mean? I had no idea what the city datum point was, but once I started researching it, there's a little square cut into the granite right here. And this was the 0 point in Seattle. This is the point from which everything in Seattle was initially measured. And there were a couple of different datum points. There was one just down the block, and when the city burned to the ground in 1889, they had to move the datum point. But this, to me, that here was where Seattle really began to measure itself and to connect itself. And it was very important to know what this number meant, 18.79. This is 18.79 feet above the 0 point in Seattle, the 0 point of elevation in Seattle, which is high tide or low tide, which one do you choose? And they chose, what they did was they measured the tide for 1 month and figured out the average and said, okay, that's 0. And this point right here is 18.79 feet above that 0 point. And from there, you could then measure all the elevations, which is important in Seattle when you're going to regrade a hill. And they say, okay, at 3rd and Cherry, it needs to be 27 feet above sea level. Well, what is sea level? Is it high tide or low tide? You had to have a 0 point, and that is right at this point in Seattle. And then another thing that really struck me that interested me, just walking around the city, this is in Beacon Hill, these walls right here, this is a retaining wall, and these concrete blocks are from when Seattle had a very extensive trolley system. In the early 1900s, late 1800s to 1936, I think it was, or thereabouts, Seattle had the trolleys went all over the city, dozens and dozens of miles, and they eventually ripped all of it up. And instead of just throwing out all the concrete blocks and all the rails that the trolleys ran on, they just cut them up and used them for retaining walls or for stairways around Seattle. So again, it was just like one of these things that attracted me, and what was the story behind it? Why did it look like that? What was different? And so I'm always out there walking in the landscape and looking for things that are odd, or maybe things people don't notice. And that, for me, is one of the fun parts, is slowing down and looking up and looking down and really looking all around to try and understand what is going on around me. And this, the final one I'll point out is these are a series of grotesques, not gargoyles, but grotesques, and I'll zoom in a little bit closer on a couple of them. These wonderful carved faces, these are carved in sandstone. They're on a building in downtown Seattle, what's known as the Broderick Building at between 1st and 2nd and James and Cherry Street. And if you look on the 4th floor and on the 5th floor, there's about 65 or so of these carved, beautifully carved faces just below the windowsills. And I have no idea who those faces are. I have no idea why they're on the building. But there are all sorts of crazy faces there. And one of the days I was down there, I was leading a tour for people. And I ran into a couple of people I knew, happened to see, as I was just standing there, and we're all looking with binoculars into this building. And that's sort of the fun thing too, is you can do weird things and come up with an excuse for why you're looking into buildings with binoculars, because you're looking for strange faces like that. But 2 people came up to me, and they both had worked in the building for 17 years each, and neither one of them had ever noticed that they had this wonderful row of faces carved into their building. So I guess for me, the point of one of the things I encourage is, again, as I say, to slow down and to ask questions. And it then gets at a point of why? What's the value of this? And I think Molly's point that was you were making earlier about this idea of connecting with the past and understanding the stories and relationship. And that's really what it ultimately boils down to for me, is developing a better connection to the place that where I live or where I'm visiting. And I get that through the observation and asking questions and understanding the history and the story of the place. So that's my take on the whole subject.
I have a question for both of you.
Okay.
And please don't
And I have some
be the only
questions
one.
too.
Join in. When you record what you do, before you even begin to ask questions, what comes first? Where's the chicken or the egg here? Do these things or mountains or animals leap out at you and that's the one I'm going to do? Or is it your own sensibility and something you've learned all along the way to slow down, to notice, whatever it is? How do you choose?
That's a good question, sort of the how do you choose what interests you? For me, it has to do with, I think you asked the point, you made the point, is it based on your experience? And yeah, for me, I'm always sort of looking for similar types of stories and trying to understand what I'm seeing, and I've seen a variety of carved faces and terracotta animals. And so for a while, I was just going and looking for those in particular. So, my bias is from a geologic point of view. I'm always trying to see geologic connections in the landscape, no matter what it is. If it's, you know, these weird carved animals, well, why is it carved in that material versus some other material? Or why does the landscape look like, why are sidewalks in downtown Seattle tilted? What's the geologic story? So I'm always, my framing is through geology. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, you know, for me, I guess as an artist, I seek beauty. So anything that causes my breath to be taken away, I know that I'm going to paint it or draw it. And I had an experience some years ago at the Cloisters Art Museum. There's this beautiful, I guess you'd call it medieval, late Middle Ages painting by Robert Campin. I can't remember the name of it, but I was standing in this other room and this man came up to it and he gasped when he saw it. And you know, that's how I feel when I see something of great natural beauty, and my aspiration is to someday create something that somebody comes up to and is in awe of, just for its sheer beauty. So that's my take.
Yes, David.
Is there a particular Seattle walk that comes to mind as one we should do now before it changes, and not necessarily in a good way?
Interesting question. Is there a particular Seattle walk that changes and not necessarily in a good way? Well, I already know that one of the walks in the book, the Building Stone walk, one of my stops doesn't exist anymore. It was where the Rainier building the Rainier building is still there, but the base of that, they removed the travertine. So in the next edition of the book, I've already had to reorient the walk. It really, unfortunately, it's the downtown walks that are ones that we're losing features, and I did consciously try and find out what I could about things. For instance, the walruses on the Arctic building. There's a parking lot that you can walk up to now and get basically right in the face of the Arctic, I mean, right on the exact level of the walruses. And that supposedly is going to be this like 80 or 90 story tall building that's directly across from the Columbia Center. It's been bought. But I was told that 2 years ago that it was going to be leveled, and it still hasn't. So it is unfortunate we're seeing that in the downtown environment. And there's a couple of buildings that I have in there that they've only been only the facade of it, that some people call, you know, they remove the entire building and they just leave the facade. They give it a facadomy, if I may give you a really horrible joke. It's not even a joke, it's an attempt at a joke. But yeah, I think the urban places are what, I think from the parks point of view, we're doing an okay job. I haven't thought about them in terms of bigger issues, say climate change, which is certainly something I'll always be concerned with. But that's a really interesting question.
So I was wondering if you're going to do another book of walks. I've only done 2 of them in the first book, but they've both been absolutely wonderful. And do you have a website where you do put updates?
It's a good question. Do I have a website where I do updates? I do. My website, geologywriter.com, has a blog on it. And it's a good question whether I've actually updated that walk. I should double check. At this point, I don't have plans for a second book, in part because I'm so deep into the next book I'm working on, which is about Puget Sound, and I had thought of doing a walks book around Puget Sound, but it didn't lend itself to the way of Seattle. When we do, we're going to do a reprint, and then the hope is to do sort of a follow-up edition once the book's been out for about 5 years, and add a couple more walks eventually. So I have some ideas in the back there. And when I did the book the first time, wrote it, I had 24, 25 different walks, and just ran out of time and energy, and ended up with 17. So I have them stored in my little tiny brain. So.
And Molly, your next book comes out in April, is that right? Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about that? What was your motivation? Why this one?
Well, I've been watching birds for a long time. I'm not an ornithologist, but as an artist, I respond to their incredible drama and beauty, and it just felt like a real natural progression from Colors of the West. And also, birds can be seen in an urban environment. So, you know, you don't have to go out to a national park to see really remarkable birds. All over Seattle, we've got them. I just saw 2 bald eagles down at Magnuson Park this morning, and that was a thrill. And then yesterday I saw pileated woodpecker on the Bird Gilman Trail. So you just see them every day. So it's more of an everyday occurrence, not so rare. So it just felt quite natural.
I have a question for you, Molly. So
Yeah.
in your book, you talk about
photographs versus sketching and the difference between sort of the social media phase that we're in now, where everybody just takes pictures of everything, versus that slowing down of sketching. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more. I was really intrigued by you about that, and something I certainly believe in, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I've just always been interested in drawing since I was a little kid. I would try to get away from my siblings by just going and drawing, because there was a lot of mayhem around my house. So I guess right off the bat, there's a peacefulness, and I don't think people find that in social media. I think it's very hectic.
even just taking photos or.
Well, yeah. One time I was at Yellowstone, and I don't want to knock photos because I take them all the time. I have 3 digital cameras. I'm thinking about getting another one. There's this really cool Nikon point and shoot that has like this zoom lens that's absolutely amazing. In fact, the guy online described it as, the zoom on this camera is sick. It's just sick. So I love cameras and I love photography, but I did have an experience at Yellowstone where I was drawing. My husband and I were sitting on one of the boardwalks at Mammoth, and this man walked behind us, and I heard his digital camera going click, 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 and it was probably about 50 to 60 clicks, and then he was gone. And I just thought, well, yeah, he'll enjoy them when he gets back and puts them up on his PC or wherever, but it's not quite the same. Like I was there for maybe 45 minutes or an hour, and I heard and saw a lot of stuff while I was there. He didn't, so.
So it's that slowing down part.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir, please.
I wondered, have you thought or looked into how native cultures, how native artists look at the landscape, and drawn any inspiration from that? Maybe there's more of a sense of deep time that might be more natural to their viewpoint. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've read a fair amount about, native tribes of the United States, and so I think that's true. One of the things I considered in the birds book was just how easy it was for Native Americans to take on birds as these kind of totemic imagery, and their own personal totems. And I find that with the work that I do for Pomegranate, the calendars and cards, people will buy things, think, this is my sister's favorite bird. This is the bird that reminds her of, whatever. So it isn't anything that's gone away. We feel the same things today. Yeah.
David, you mentioned the marker at Pioneer Square that measures the
City datum, yeah.
And then there's that marker behind the convention center.
Oh,
There's
right.
a little map. Are there many more of those around the city like that?
Good question, Mom. She's my mom. That's why I do what I do, because I've been inspired by my mom. But yeah, there are many maps, and I think that's one of the things that really I like about Seattle is that you can go around and find some of these. The one she's referring to, I had planned on writing about in the book. It's behind the convention center. It's a map of the early surveyors who came out into the Seattle area, the General Land Office surveyors, the GLO, the Cadastral Survey. The first map they did when they were moving into it was sort of the one that established the baseline. And that map is etched into the concrete. There's a sculpture called by George or George that's right there. It's sort of interesting. And just closer to the building from it is this map sketched in or etched in. The weird thing is you can't always see it. It's sort of like Brigadoon. It just sort of periodically appears in some weather. I see it. And I've walked by, I know exactly where it is. I've walked by it and not been able to see it. Sometimes I see it. There's a map there. There's a couple other weird little points. There's the World Trade building that's along the waterfront. There's a stone there that I think has a connection that points directly to Ireland, like the shortest route to Ireland. So there are a bunch of these, and for me, that was just always fun to walk around. I'm always interested in maps and trying to find these different maps around the city. One of the walks in the book tries to tie together a bunch of these points, except the two that I just told you about, because they're so hard to see and they're out of the way. But again, for me, it's that connective tissue to place that I'm always interested in, and maps are such a fabulous way to connect people to the place.
Yeah, that hitching post you showed us on 14th Avenue, is that really 14th East?
Yeah, it's 14th East, yeah. So it's what they still call, some people call Millionaires Road, that road that comes directly out of Volunteer Park up there. There's two of the hitching posts. There's 2 or 3 other hitching posts that I've come across in Seattle. I'm always looking for hitching posts, which is sort of points how exciting my life is. That I'm now looking for hitching posts I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but I've tried to get people interested in hitching posts over time. So.
There's a building in South Lake Union, an Amazon building. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it was designed in a way that's supposed to sort of give a rough approximation of where the regrade, where the elevation was before the regrade. And it has a podium that's a sort of a terracotta color, and the end of that podium is where the elevation used to be. And you enter into the main entrance of the building, and there's a surveyor's map of the elevation.
Oh, I know the surveyor's map. It's on 8th
and Thomas or something.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was another part of it, huh? I'll have to go
The
look.
facade of the building, has it a line on it? or
Well,
something?
it's not pointed out, but there's like an orange-brown part of the building.
Oh, okay, I know exactly what you're talking
And then there's the
about.
windows up above. And what I've been told by some architect who lives in the area, is that the top of that is supposed to be an approximation of where the elevation used to be.
Oh, interesting.
The top of the podium.
It's 8th and Thomas, or
Ish,
somewhere in
yes.
that area. No, I know exactly, and I've been meaning to do a blog about it, because I've seen the surveyor's things. I know exactly where that's from.
Yeah.
But interesting, I will look for that. Speaking of that, one of the things I tried to do when I was working on the book was the high point of Denny Hill was at 4th and Blanchard, which right now is where what they call the Darth Vader building is, across near the Coliseum. And the owner of that building is Martin Seelig, the developer. And I know someone who gave me Martin Selig's phone number and a connection to him. And so I call him up and I go, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could put like a line on your building on the 10th floor around to designate where the high point of Denny Hill was? Wouldn't that be really cool? And he says, yeah, that just doesn't resonate with me. And the conversation ended. You know, what do you say at that point? It doesn't resonate when you're goodbye. Yeah, goodbye, basically. You're hitting it goodbye. So I've never been able to get that. I would love, but there's another building just around the corner that's I forget what the name is. It's a hotel that basically the top of that is equivalent in elevation to what Denny Hill was at that point. There's a couple. The other one is the Moore Theater. The top of the Moore Theater is exactly even with the elevation of Denny Hill at that point. But that's another spot. Since I'm out here yammering on. If you go to 2nd and Virginia, it's a really weird spot. I got to 2nd and Virginia one day, and I'm standing there, and I realized that all the streets from 2nd and Virginia slope down from you. That is the high point of Denny Hill at this point. Historically, it was at 4th and Blanchard. It's now at 2nd and Virginia, and there's a whole story and history why that one spot remained a little bit in elevation. So next time you're downtown, when you walk along there, notice that everything rises up to 2nd and Virginia. Other questions?
I have one more for you
Good.
before we scream and yell and have a good time. You both speak, you both teach, you've lectured, you've done all kinds of things. How do you teach us to slow down?
I find the classes that I teach for the outdoor institutes, Yellowstone Forever, North Cascades, people will often say to me, wow, I've got this whole weekend to just do things very slowly. And, you know, on a much smaller scale, when I do things for King County Library and adults and or children, I work with kids 8 and up. I think they really appreciate the chance to work with I bring natural objects of various kinds. It's not like your everyday life. And I had an interesting thing happen at one workshop where a woman said, this was down on the Oregon coast at Persitka Center for Art and Ecology. She said, you know, I feel like I spend all my life and all my time consuming one thing or another, you know, like, well, I watch movies, or I go to the store, I buy clothes, you know, I consume a lot. And this weekend I felt like I actually created something, I produced something. And I think sometimes it's easier for people to slow down if they feel like, oh, I'm actually producing something here.
For me, I guess it's this idea of slowing down, but it's asking questions and just trying to pay attention and not be in such a hurry. I mean, you know, one of the great things about Seattle, at least it used to be, is that we used to all stop at stoplights, where it said, you know, don't walk. We used to stop, and now everyone sort of seems to go, well, I still stop. I've been just coming down the street here, and you know, 3 or 4 people went across. I'm not in a hurry, and I think if you can consciously slow down and give yourself permission to do it. I think a lot of times we feel we're always having to move to get from point A to point B, but giving yourself permission to slow down and ask questions. The other is travel with friends and move more slowly with them and have conversations, and just to be observant. If you do decide to take a picture, don't take one, take 10 of it. And you know, so you're forced to look at something at a building or a landscape in different ways. So don't think the traditional way. You know, try and do things a little bit out of the ordinary for it. And I think that's, for me in the city, it's particularly important. And it's easier in some ways for me in the outdoors to do it. But in the city, which is so frenetic and rushed around us, I think it helps me feel more comfortable here. My mom probably laughs because I don't drive that way at all. But when I'm walking, I really am that way about just sort of trying to notice things. And a lot of times I just go back over and over places. I mean, downtown, I still find new things in downtown. And one of the reasons I like to lead walks is because people point things out that I've never seen. And all the times I've been down and leading walks, every time someone goes, oh, did you notice? I'm like, oh, I realized I hadn't noticed. So I sometimes realize, or I always realize there's so much more to see. There's so many great stories. And that, to me, is what it gets back to. It's these wonderful stories that happen.
Thank you both so much.
You get
This is Molly Hashimoto on my left, and that's David Williams over there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you both very much.